so long. It's from a virtual perspective. So we heard from you, John. So we'll come back to you in a minute. So I am going to start. Actually, I'm going to start with Barry here because we had a conversation a little while ago where you were telling me a little bit more about EPS Global and what you do as an organisation. And I think it'd be really worthwhile for you to share a little bit about what EPS Global does and some of your customers in the context of this and why the approach of kind of bare boxes is a good one for many people.
Yeah, cool. Everyone hear me? So I'm Barry from EPS. EPS were founded in Dublin 22 years ago, and I think initially they started selling transceivers, so optics from Finisar around 26. So I think then they decided, well, what do these go into? So they started selling switches. So started working with Edge Core Networks about 8 or 9 years ago. And for anyone who doesn't know who Edge Core are, they're part of the Acton group. And basically these guys make switches for everybody around the globe. Juniper, Dell, HP, and so on. So they decided to spin out their own company called Edge Core, making bare metal hardware. So bare metal is open source, as John is saying. So you have a couple of different types. You have bright boxes, which would be HP and Dell, which are bare metal with a logo on them. You have white boxes, which are bare metal with an operating system, sometimes open source, sometimes commercial. And then you have bare metal, which is just the bare metal box. And the way that kind of comes about actually is through the OCP, who John works for, and we're members of as well for the last 7 or 8 years. So say Facebook, for example. Facebook will give in a design specification and will just say a 10 gig switch with, say, 6 100 gig uplinks. They'll give that specification into the OCP, and then the OCP will send that out to guys like Edge Core. There's another bunch of guys, Qantas, Estica, Delta. There's a lot of guys making this bare metal stuff. And they'll send back the design back into the OCP, and the OCP will basically ratify that design, and then Edge Core will have this switch built and will sell it to Facebook. So this is how this kind of circular economy works for these big hyperscalers. So yeah, we've been doing that now. We're members of the OCP for 8 years. We've been working within kind of data centers for the last 6 or 7 years. And then we've moved into the telecom space now. So the last 4 years, there's 2 different groups, the Telecom Infra Project and the ONF, which is the Open Networking Foundation. And they started to move the same stuff that's happening within the data center for the last 12 years and moving into the telecom space. And basically all the tier ones in the telecom space are working there. So the pandemic wasn't good for us with the data center stuff because maybe they're built too well now. We were just sending stuff to people's houses for the last 2 years, sending fans and PSUs to all over EMEA. So we kind of pivoted a little bit and started working more with bare metal in the telecom space, and to this point, it's been a huge success. But we've gone back to the data center. We have Sonic as an open source operating system sitting on bare metal, which is starting to get huge traction. So that's good.
So I think one of the things that I think surprised me when we were having a chat, didn't surprise me in one way, but didn't surprise me in another way. I mean, one of the things that's been happening overall in the technology industry in the last number of years is that what we're seeing is that many organizations are realizing that these vanilla horizontal offerings that might be available in any field or in any area are not necessarily always fit for purpose for the most ambitious companies. So the most ambitious companies who are moving ahead further, faster, are learning how to specialize and get what they need for their particular needs. And I think one of the things that really struck me when I was talking about your customers and what they're doing is that essentially they're learning from the big hyperscalers and then taking and being able to decide what is the best solution for them to be most cost efficient, to be most energy efficient. And companies like yourself can help them do that, so they don't have to get all that expertise themselves.
So it started with open source operating systems. We have commercial ones and open source, but the diversity in them means for your specific application, you can get exactly what you need. And obviously sitting on bare metal, you're not locked in with vendors, as John spoke about vendor lock-in. You're not locked in with Cisco. If they want, they're not going to build you a feature. They might build it for Facebook, but Facebook have their own operating system called FPOS. But yeah, the choice and sitting on bare metal means obviously CapEx savings.
And a lot of people for a long time in the open source ecosystem might have actually held back a bit because they're thinking, okay, well, this would require a hell of a lot of skills that I don't have. But I think what I think is emerging is a very healthy ecosystem with companies like EPS Global who can help people get there. And I think, when I heard about the work that you do and the fact that you may have started 20 years ago with just doing switches, but now you're actually kind of a full service organization that can help people get from here are my needs to what does that look like in the open source world. So there's actually someone to hold your hand on that journey, and like for me that's one of the things that I'm not sure people are aware of, because sometimes people go with the proprietary solutions just because they've got a throat to choke. But in this particular instance, you've got a hand to hold, a friendly face, right?
Yeah, no, we found that really important. So system integrators and even resellers to a certain point. So we basically had to take it from start to finish. Now the software vendors and the hardware vendors will help you along. So, but we take a customer for a data center or for a central office, basically from start to finish, and bring in software vendors to help with specific features. But after that, it was a necessity to do it rather than. But there's lots of system integrators looking at this now, and some of the biggest ones in Europe are working on this.
So I think that's brilliant. So and I suppose just to put that in context, one of the reasons why we're here as Open Ireland Network is simply because what's emerging around this is a real economic opportunity for organisations in Ireland. And it's wonderful to hear folks like yourselves who are already taking advantage of that. But the opportunity is growing. As John mentioned, the growth in this area is phenomenal in terms of the actual adoption, and it's going to become even more so as regulations change. So, again, incredibly important to look at this both from the perspective of mitigating risk for the future in terms of where trends are going, but also as an economic opportunity on the back of some of these trends. So thanks so much, Barry. Niall, I'm going to come to you now because, again, I just want to point out here, one of the reasons, again, for this community, the Open Ireland Network, is to get the stories out about what's happening in Ireland. From my perspective, I wasn't aware of a lot of this work that's happening here, and really, I think it's worthwhile and bears value for us all to be able to tell the stories of things that are happening in Ireland. So again, work at the Cube. Tell us all about the Cube, Niall, because I was really impressed with work that's happening in the middle of Ireland.
Sure, thanks so much, Claire. So the Cube, for those of you that don't know, is a national centre. We're funded by Enterprise Ireland and the IDA, and our general remit is to develop economic opportunity through the transition to net zero across government and across business in Ireland. So although we're here under open compute and ICT context today, we do across a broad sector of industries. But specifically regarding ICT, I guess through a couple of conversations I've had with John and Claire and various other people, we've come to see the opportunity that's available. And actually John touched on a lot of it in the previous presentation for those of you that are lucky enough to see it. There's a lot of movement coming down the line in terms of government regulations, in terms of mandatory requirements of the data centre industry. And there's going to be a lot of focus on that Scope 3 emission that John spoke about. So what we've done in the Cube and what we've worked at over the last 12 to 15 months is to establish partnerships that can develop positioned data centres across Ireland that are sustainable and green in focus, that are have a full 360-degree view on sustainability, not just focusing on energy, but focusing on Scope 2 and 3 as much as that. And we put in place a number of partners in that regard, from government through to the energy providers across Ireland, through to OCP systems delivery software or hardware deliverers into the country as well. And we've done a lot of work in terms of engaging that community that Claire mentioned. So there's a lot of misunderstanding out there about this industry. There's a lot of misunderstanding or lack of knowledge of what's coming down the line in terms of government regulation. So what we've tried to do is put in place a forum whereby we can link the right parties together to open up opportunities going forward for Ireland in terms of our economic future, in terms of data centres, and making sure that that's in line with the national sustainability agenda as well.
That's brilliant, thank you, Niall. Now I'll just pause very briefly to say, if anyone has a question for any of our panellists, can you please come to this mic in the centre? And at any time, don't wait for me to call on you. If anyone has a question or wants to learn more about anything, just please step up and we'll bring your question to the panel. So appreciate that if anyone does, just feel free to step up. But in the meantime, one of the things I want to get back to, because John talked about the circular economy and the economic opportunities that are not just in the context of actually betting on open source hardware to begin with, which obviously are huge. Oh, well actually no, I will defer to our gentleman in the audience who's come. Thank you very much for asking the first question. Would you like to introduce yourself and please ask the question to the panel?
Yeah, probably a bit of an introduction question as well.
Just 1 second till we make sure we can hear you. Oh yeah, we got Steffes. Give me a nod, off you go.
Yeah, all good?
All good.
I'm here representing Signify from my Philips IC, and we just celebrated a year as a carbon neutral company, huge company. We actually go over the EPD side of it as well, but we had some people speaking at COP26.
Sorry, is it Mark?
Yes.
Could you step a little closer to the mic? Sorry, we're just, thank you. Sorry, apologies, we couldn't hear you there.
Didn't want to spoil anything. Yes, so my question is, what more as a manufacturer, as quite a large manufacturer as well, who see themselves as a carbon neutral company, what more could we do?
Hello. Is that working? What can you do to try and live your mission, so to speak? Because there is, I use the term greenwash, everybody says greenwash. There's a lot of greenwash and misunderstanding of terms. Like, I had a discussion this morning at breakfast. There's an organisation in Europe to do with data centres that are trying to create guidance documents on what they call climate neutral data centres, so they can get in there and give this information to regulators when they bring it in. Okay? Well, I don't know whether you know, but climate neutral is a nonsense. You can be carbon neutral, but you can't be climate neutral. So the first thing I would say is understand the science, understand what sustainability is, and understand what the regulators are going to do to make you kind of transition your business. One thing, if you really want to decarbonise your supply chain, is the first thing you've got to do is you've got to understand it. So I would recommend, and they're like rocking horse shit, I would recommend you get somebody who knows how to develop EPDs. Find a consultancy that's not as busy as hell, yeah? For example, there's a company...
John, if I can just ask you to explain the acronym for those of us who might be familiar with it.
The EPD is what I mentioned up there, the Environmental Product Descriptor, which is, it gives you a document associated with all your equipment. That's what it's about. And in there, you've got the carbon emissions. Just focus on the carbon. Don't worry about all the pollutants and all the rest of it for now. It all gets too complicated. Just the carbon. And if you get that individual in, they will start to expose where you're getting these high emissions contributing into your supply chain. And you might want them to move your supply chain in a different direction. Okay? Because the more complex the supply chain, the higher the emissions that are embodied. That's a rule of thumb. So if you can try and simplify your supply chain, you will start to decarbonise at scope 3. I won't worry about all the other stuff, just scope 3, and that's what I say. And follow the methods that are laid down under within COP, you heard them talking about scientific determination of emissions. Try and understand it. I don't fully understand it. I just get it every morning at breakfast with my wife. She understands it. And as I was just going to say, there's a company in Finland called Click One. And they are growing like frenzy. They are absolutely growing like frenzy. And what they've done, they've developed software to start to measure complex scope 3 supply chain. And if you want a job, they now want to recruit another 20 people. Now, 2 years ago, there was like 4 people sitting in an office. Today, there's about 30 of them. And that's all they do. They just measure scope 3. So talk to them, understand your supply chain, where the emissions are coming from, and optimise them to reduce. And then you'll have what we call an environmental business advantage over your competitors, which will win your business. So that's all I can do. Dig into the detail.
We're looking at quite a bit of detail at the moment, but also we're looking at doing modelling, so carbon modelling, exactly what it is that we put out there. Like I said, carbon neutral anyway, but it's important to give that information to customers to make sure they realise exactly what we're doing to promote that. So, good advice.
just one other thing that you can do. Because of the open source community being so important in all of this, within the Open Compute project, there's a new subgroup that started called Sustainability. Get involved with them. You will find, if you work with them in this open collaborative way, you will find your customers. Because the people who are playing in that space are not just the vendors, but they're the big consumers of the technology that you would use, and you will get relationships with people that will become your customers.
So, and I think that's a really good point. If I got you right, Mark, you know, this idea of the motivation to change and where that comes from and how we can accelerate it in the context of folks that are going on this path to having more sustainable, environmentally friendly solutions to offer and are offering, you know, where they see the opportunity in this respect. Can maybe we actually have a quick chat about that motivation? So one of the things Mark was talking about is like creating the consumer demand. So we know that, for example, regulations are going to be coming that are going to be forcing the consumers to actually start looking at this. But can we just have a little talk about right now, like where we're at with that and what is the awareness of that in the industry? So what we've heard today is where it's, you know, to a certain degree is where it's going inevitably, right? But can you maybe comment on, from your perspective, you're all talking to organisations every day on this journey. Where do you feel we're on in terms of this adoption curve for the awareness of this type of value proposition? Because, like I said, when I first heard about it only a couple of months ago, I was like, oh, I hadn't thought about any of this. I hadn't heard about any of this in the mainstream responses to data centres and what's happening here. So obviously, I'm not necessarily at the heart of this industry, but at the same time, it strikes me that it's an incredibly worthwhile conversation to be having. So can I maybe ask you in turn, where do we think we are right now in terms of the awareness of the value proposition related to everything we've been talking about today? Niall, can I ask you first? Oh yeah, sorry Mark, and feel free to come back and ask another question on the back of that, that's all right, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, just to answer that, Claire, I think it really depends on what section of the industry you're speaking to in terms of where they see the future and what they need to be doing from a regulation perspective. If you look at smaller organisations, and we deal with SMEs, smaller businesses every day of the week, they generally have no idea what's coming in terms of carbon neutrality or sustainability. Generally speaking, they don't know where to start. So in terms of their data requirements, in terms of what's going to happen in terms of the data center industry, that's just a million miles off their radar. So the kind of the smaller cases certainly have no industry idea. Obviously the larger hyperscalers are well indoctrinated in this space. They've already been working on it for multiple years. They've Facebook essentially created the OCP industry as we know today, so their awareness is obviously highly evolved. Whereas when we look at the co-location side of things, there tends to be a little bit of, from what my conversation, certainly an understanding that's there, but it's certainly not a blind eye that's been turned to it, because I think it doesn't completely align with their business goals. So I think there can be tend to be an understanding, but then the systems and the strategies that put in place going to go a different direction.
I think that's a really important one. I remember talking to you, John. You had a story about a particular objection, or when you were talking to some folks in a data center about the kind of narrow focus of some individuals when they're given business goals that may not actually be aware of where these trends are going. So can you maybe share that story? Because I think it's an important one to help understand this. Do you remember what I'm talking about? The one where you were talking about the energy consumption and whose job is it to actually reduce energy consumption? It's important to address that, I think.
Yeah, this was just, if you go into an enterprise data center and you talk to the IT people and you say, how much did you spend on electricity last year? They don't know. Talk to the data center manager, they often don't know what their consumption is, how much it's costing. That's often the facilities people. There's a disconnect. And the way you solve these complex problems, you have to change the way you think. And this is what's fundamental to this transition. You'll hear people talking about complex systems thinking, design thinking. Now, this is where it's going to get a bit difficult because our educational system teaches reductionism. It teaches isolated silos of specialism. Well, climate change isn't an isolated problem, it's a global complex systems problem. So when you go and start talking to these people that are recommended to you that do all this analysis, you will be amazed on how they connect everything together. That's why they need software, because it's so complicated. So somehow you've got to get this to go right across the industry so that the people who are working in a data centre understand what the issue is. They understand that if they do this, it's going to create more emissions. So it's a big education thing. We have to get this connectivity throughout the organisation. The nearest I can put to it, where we're going with this kind of awareness on system thinking on climate change and decarbonisation, is it's like, if you go back about 25, 30 years ago, everybody was obsessed in total quality management systems. Now, total quality management systems was trying to do the same thing. It was trying to make people understand how their system worked and how the customer was part of the system. So you started to take on this systems approach. I was very fortunate then that I was actually doing a management training course and I was learning all this stuff as well. So I'm quite unusual that I know about system thinking and design thinking. But that's the transition we need to get into within organisations. Then you start to see the synergies occurring between the person who looks after electricity, who's got no relationship with the carbon emissions, and other people who have no idea what the consumption is on electricity.
Thank you, John. Barry, can I ask you, when you're talking to your customers, who in your customers, like what role is driving this conversation? Who are the most motivated around it?
Well, this has been discussed at board level of every company, and even as a distributor, we're discussing greener products like ARM CPUs in servers and lithium-ion batteries instead of lead-acid batteries and stuff like that. So it's being talked about. But when it comes to the network, the storage and compute section, it's a bit different. So they're looking more at what the software will do and using more capacity. So say using 20 or 40% of the capacity in servers, you want to be using 60 to 80% in open source software will help with that, and good orchestration platforms. So I'm talking to the network guys, and they're looking at ways to do it, but then there is a disconnect between board level and what the network guys are doing.
So would it be useful, and I'll ask this to the audience, you can all tell me if it would it be useful to even have a map of some of these value propositions? Because again, like it strikes me that many of them are new, but that actually different people care about different things depending on where they are in the industry, depending on where they are in their organisation. Do you feel that's clear, like the value proposition for each role and for each organisation, or would it be a worthwhile exercise? And I'm thinking here about a job that the community could do together, to be able to map those value propositions to help both everyone that's in the ecosystem today and some folks who may be just starting their journey and going on this pathway. Would that help?
Yeah, it definitely would.
I'm making a to-do list on the back of my notebook here now, so I'll be coming back around you to get all this now after the fact.
But from the networking side, there is no push for us. There is to use more capacity of our switches and of our servers, but that's down to ourselves to do. There's no kind of join together thinking on it as well.
But if I can just throw in something here, is these guys got involved with the London Internet Exchange. And what was so funny, that the London Internet Exchange is a core hub globally for the internet. And they were using proprietary kind of monolithic switches. They had a nightmare trying to change anything. And they started looking at what the hyperscalers were doing on open source switching. And I thought, this is so clever. We can really make it simple. The setup, Barry will tell you about the setup speeds, how quickly it's all automated. You can have a big network, you basically, you get a memory stick, you plug it into the first switch and it just all starts to configure itself up. So there's none of this manual intervention, it's very agile. But when the guy did the presentation from London Internet Exchange on the story, his big point was nothing to do with what we originally thought. It was about the energy savings on the switches, wasn't it? And you can go and look at this presentation. But what's key, I think, is you've got to bring as much diversity into the group on things that you might not think is related to switching technology or circuit technology, and it is profound. And there's one little fact that, you've got a lot of the people in here are mechanical and electrical people in the data center industry. Generally, that's the focus here. So they're focused on kind of trying to tune that little bit of froth at the top, if they reduce it by 50%, they've only reduced 5% by 50%, which is 2.5%. The black stuff at the bottom, the way you can reduce that is circularity, but another thing is dematerialisation of the equipment. Now, you can use software to dematerialise the hardware, because as Barry said, if the server is only working at an average utilisation of about 6 to 12%, if you increase its workload constantly, you don't need so much hardware, because one box does more work. And it is so profound, so with the implementation of open source software, you can dematerialise the amount of servers that you need by 90%. Now that's 90% of 90% of all your emissions, and it's a huge cost reduction. But unless you join together the software engineers with the hardware engineers, and this is what EPS have been forced to do, they were just selling widgets, hardware widgets. Now they're a software services company as well. You have to join all the dots.
I love the idea of everyone working together more in terms of actually building this ecosystem. And I think, you know, some of the opportunities again now you're going into here is this idea of supporting the circular ecosystem and the folks that can actually do that and building the skills. But actually, there's even more opportunity in terms of kind of spin-out industries that can happen here. I mean, this is one of the most exciting things from my perspective when I heard about this open ecosystem. Because, I mean, it's not just the folks, either software engineers or hardware engineers, who could potentially benefit from some of the changes that are happening here. Like, what we're actually seeing is, for people who get really creative, and I know that the community around the Cube are getting really creative, they're exploring even broader potentials for spin-outs and economic impact. So Niall, maybe you can tell us some of those stories, because again, I find them fascinating.
Well, yeah, sure. I think you're referring to the industrial symbiosis piece. So, yeah, one of the things we do in the Cube is obviously to try and develop out regional efficiencies, regional advantages for areas. And we started to look at pockets of capacity around the country where these carbon neutral data centres, these sustainable data centres could be positioned. One of the things we looked at is the ability to link that into industrial symbiosis. And what that is essentially taking one industry which might be completely unrelated to data centres and taking a waste efficiency out of that data centre that can be then used within that industry. So a great example of this is actually something that John mentioned in the previous presentation in Holland, whereby they're taking waste heat and they're putting it into greenhouses, and there's a kind of symbiotic relationship there where there's cost savings and revenue generation.
Bananas, I don't know.
Yeah, no, not bananas, thankfully. We don't have the climate here. But
because the bananas, the skins of bananas are used to make organic plastics. So when you see an OCP piece of kit, it's got these green bits on it. They're made of bananas.
Thanks for that. Another aside, thank you. Interesting fact from John, number 52. Sorry, Niall.
Yeah, so that's one example, and when we're looking into the potential to do something like that, similar with the farming industry around the country and food production, other things as well, the reuse of water flowing through data centres. We all know there's massive amounts of wastewater. How can we reuse that water? How can we desalinate it, reduce the wastewater amounts, and then repatriate it into businesses? So, yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there, and even in a social perspective, we've seen through CODEMA here in Dublin, the National District Heating Project that's been flowing. I think the government have plans for 2 or 3 more of them. So there's opportunities across the board really, and when we in the Cube put forward a project, we always have to have that economic mindset in place. It can't just be about the sustainability side, we also have to look at how we can create economic opportunities. So linking that data centre piece into that industrial symbiosis is really, really important.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, John.
What he's really saying is the system boundary is going beyond the data centre. We're taking other utilities and we're bringing them into a system, a bigger system. And fundamentally, the problem that we have at the end is a planetary problem. The new economic models are about the system is the planet. So all the new economic models, you'll hear this term about 21st century economic models coming through really strongly, often driven by women who have a bigger understanding than men do with this kind of reductionist mindset. So you'll start to see some of the old economic terms disappear, and you'll start to hear this term called the embedded economy model. And why it's called the embedded economy model is because it's the economy embedded in the planet, a finite resource. So what you're going to start to see, you're going to start to see system boundaries blurring and going planet-wide. Now, everybody's heard of IoT, yeah, and the way we're going to get intelligent cities, or the way we're going to network everything. Again, you can't do that unless you open things up. You can't have proprietary islands of intelligence in a city and get the big data benefits and all the kind of efficiency benefits unless they can talk to each other. So this is why Open UK is very much into open data, because when we collect all the data, it has to be in a format that everybody can use and use it for business benefits and also for the intelligent kind of drive in cities to make them more sustainable. So as you break the boundaries and get bigger and bigger, you'll see a big push again towards open source technologies.
And if I can just add on to that, because I mean, you know, I think that the discussion about the fact that this is large and complex and that the opportunities stretch beyond the data center industry in this respect is completely valid. I'll also point out, though, that in the context of the discussions about consumer awareness and driving motivation, like the PR ability of some of these stories for a broader audience that don't understand networks and switching and the deep core bit of the data center industry. But the idea of a data center enabling the power for a nearby village, or you know, growing bananas or strawberries or whatever you might be doing on the side, the PR of that kind of thing is really driving a lot of the large organizations to say, we need some good stories about where we're doing our computing, and we need some good stories to counter anything that might be perceived to be negative in the context of how we're doing our engineering and our whatever we're doing from a technical perspective. And sometimes these stories are so much more powerful because they are broader than the area of focus itself. So, you know, I'll just point out that you can take this macro and say, yeah, it's all very complex, but actually some of these tiny little stories are very powerful in themselves to drive motivation of change.
Yeah, what we need is storytellers. And, you know, I've travelled and lived around the world, and the best storytellers are in Ireland. I had a meal a couple of days ago. It started at 4 o'clock and it finished at 12:15, you know, in the morning, because it was stories. And it's not about writing things down, it's storytellers that create a kind of a consciousness shift. And if you want a good book to read, it's called The Three Horizons, and it's how stories move consciousness. So when we start to get this, people like the final end user, if you like, needs to be aware. They need to have, like on a refrigerator, a kind of a guide rainbow chart saying, yeah, it's an A, I'm going to buy an A. Because I know it's going to cost me less for electricity, but it's also going to have less emissions. And we'll start to see that coming out on food. In fact, on some supermarkets now, when you buy the food, it tells you what the embedded carbon is inside. And the young are buying their food in that way.
So that's a tip in terms of like the, you know, looking at a demographic perspective. I'm going to come to each of our panelists that now then. I'll take that one as yours, John, but we can come back around if you think of another one. But I'm going to ask each of you now, so if you thought about one opportunity, right, I'll even give you two, that you would then say to this audience and anyone who may be watching after the fact, about how to progress on this journey. Not just take the first steps, but how you can really accelerate on this journey. What advice would you give organisations who are looking to explore this path and perhaps gain some of the opportunities that are mentioned here today? Niall.
So what I would say is get ahead of the regulation. There's a lot of regulation coming, and a lot of how we've seen the industry today will be defunct very soon. So if we can start to put in place systems, technologies that are going to, I suppose, fit into that low carbon agenda going forward, they'll be the winners, because essentially supply chains are going to have to move towards green, so those customers, those people looking to put their data into data centres in the future will look to do it in green facilities. So it's very important to put that in place now.
Thank you, Niall. Barry, what about you?
Yeah, so have a look at open hardware, open software. So John described, it was 10 years ago when Facebook, Microsoft, and all the hyperscale data centers moved to this stuff. 2016, the telco side moved to it, and that's a huge success now. We're moving into campus and enterprise networking, so there's a solution there for everybody. There's generally a software that will fit your application better than what Cisco or Juniper have. So yeah, look at open source hardware and software, and you can do that at EPS.
John, any further words from you other than tell more stories?
the Irish are brilliant stories, but just one little story. There's a company called Rakuten. It's a Japanese company. They started doing internet selling like Amazon. So if you bought something, you go on the web, you buy something, it gets delivered to your house. They've got a very inspirational chief executive, and what he's worked out is that the mobile phone is core to the future. So they're transferred to becoming a technology company. Now, because of the hurdle that mobile phone technology is expensive, especially infrastructure build out, when you build out infrastructures for 5G, it's very, very expensive. So he brought in a new guy called Tariq Amin, who was, you cut him in half and he's open source all over. He's got background in Facebook. Brought this guy in to build out the 5G infrastructure in Japan for them, because Rakuten are now becoming an operator, a competitor. This guy is amazing what he's done. He's brought together all these open source communities. There's something that Barry will tell you all about Open RAN, Open Radio Access Networks, which they've implemented. They're going to build out the infrastructure in Japan 5 years ahead of schedule because of this technology. They're going to dematerialise the amount of data centres they need by 90%. The cost has fallen through the floor. Rakuten now realise they're onto such a good proposition, they've set up a new company 3 months ago called Rakuten Symphony, which are now going to be a solution provider for telco infrastructures around the world, and the prediction is that by the end of this decade it'll be a $100 billion business. And that's the impact on the traditional telco space. It's huge.
Well, I think, John, you must have some Irish blood in you, because you're not so bad at telling the stories yourself. But there's a lot of talk about where the next tech unicorns will come from in Ireland, and I think what we're hearing here today is that there's plenty of opportunity in the open hardware space, that could be a potential opportunity. I'll finish up this panel session by also adding that, you know, a lot of this stuff might have been spearheaded by the big hyperscalers, and indeed we'll be hearing from Mark O'Neill from Microsoft later on today at 1 o'clock in the other hall if you want to come along and hear what Microsoft are doing in this space. But I do think that what's happening is that as they may have led the way, the communities of smaller organisations who are coming together to collaborate on this stuff and to look for the other niche opportunities and the ways in which you can actually bring forward the SME organisations or the mid-sized organisations, that's where a lot of the opportunity is now in the future, because the hyperscalers are doing their own thing anyway in terms of actually moving forward the cutting edge piece of this. But the opportunity to take what they have shown us and actually adapt it for every other need on the planet, and look at all these opportunities from a industrial, what's it again? Symbiosis. I love that. Industrial. I learned a new term here as well. Industrial symbiosis. So that, love it. Just full of the sound bites here today.
Can I give you another one?
Go on.
Biomimicry.
Biomimicry.
You'll hear that one coming through.
Excellent. We've got like buzzwords galore here. Anyway, but listen, I just want to say thank you so much to this community. If you're thinking about following on the conversation and continuing to learn about this, I would, and I will be speaking about it just in a little while about the Open Ireland Network, but all three of these fabulous panellists are involved, and we do hope to be able to take this conversation further, to share the stories, to uncover the stories, to share the stories, and to look at the opportunities for us all working together, because I think it's in that collaboration where we can actually leverage the most opportunity together. So again, I want to thank you, Niall, I want to thank you, Barry, I want to thank you, John, for a great panel session. Really appreciate that. Thank you so much.